Our first book about Afghanistan, published in 2009, is titled Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. That title was chosen because so many of the facts that drive America's understanding of Afghanistan today have been and remain invisible to those who need them the most. Our latest book, published just last year, is titled Crossing Zero, The AfPak War at the Turning Point of American Empire. There were two main reasons for naming our new book Crossing Zero. The literal one is that zero line is the name given to the Durand Line, separating Afghanistan and Pakistan by the military intelligence community. It's a line that the US has fought on both sides of since the 1980s. The other is that given its history, zero line is an inescapable metaphor for the turning point at which the United States finds itself after 10 years of war in a place known throughout the ages as the graveyard of empires. Being a graveyard for empires is not what makes Afghanistan unique, though. Empires have fallen just about everywhere. But Afghanistan remains a very special place whose mystical allure imposes a supreme challenge on those who seek the riches of empire. The reasons for this could be that Afghanistan dates back to the origins of the Western dream, to Alexander the Great and the beginning of Western civilization. It could be because it's a gateway to Asia and the vast riches of the Eurasian plain. Or it could be that the British spent more than a century trying to subdue its Pashtun tribes on the northwest frontier of India and failed. The Soviet Union was lured to Afghanistan in the 1980s. So was the United States a little more than a decade later, and if you can believe the Taliban, with similar consequences. After 10 years of grueling Western occupation and over 30 years of war, Afghanistan more than ever remains synonymous with the unknowable and the unattainable. From Alexander the Great to Rudyard Kipling to 9/11, it is an epic story into which the United States was drawn, but from our own experience has yet to come to grips with its role within this epic. When we first entered the Afghan debate in 1981, we did so with the intention of taking the story out from under the curtain of Cold War and superpower confrontation. We, of course, knew that wouldn't be easy. At the time, we were told that the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan as part of a grand plan initiated in the 19th century to obtain warm water ports and control trade routes to the Persian Gulf. Following the 1979 invasion, President Jimmy Carter had called it the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. Harvard professor Richard Pipes appeared alongside former US Ambassador Theodore Elliott and pronounced that the Soviets were bent on world domination and using Afghanistan as a springboard for a Middle East conquest and perhaps even a European conquest. 2 weeks later, the entire country had been blacked out to Western eyes. 6 months later, we convinced the Afghan government that this was not something that was working in their interest, and they agreed to allow us a brief glimpse of what life was like under their rule. After negotiating a contract with CBS News, I flew to Afghanistan. But what I saw in Kabul was in stark contrast to what I expected. What was immediately obvious that spring of 1981 confirmed what people outside the United States had been saying for some time, that what was happening in Afghanistan bore little relation to reports appearing in the US media. If this was a simple black and white struggle between good and evil, it was not obvious from the ground level. The local population was unhappy with the Soviet occupation, but they were also unhappy with the terrorists who were coming in over the border from Pakistan, burning schools for women, blowing up power lines, and assassinating civil authorities. Afghans had been living with this sort of thing for hundreds of years, where Mughal satraps or British agents would recruit the most backward and reactionary elements of Afghan society and turn them against reformers in Kabul who were attempting to bring Afghanistan into the modern era. Despite official denials from Washington, the Afghans I spoke with had evidence that the US was behind the attacks and could not understand why this sort of thing was being supported by Washington. From their limited experience, the United States was not a colonial power. Even the Afghan communists were uncomfortable with the Soviet presence and embarrassed at needing 100,000 Soviet troops to prop up their government. The information minister at the foreign ministry told me, point blank, my country would rather have American aid than Russian soldiers. When we return, please convey this message to the authorities. After struggling with the footage for a month, CBS finally aired a news segment about what I didn't see, intercut with Soviet propaganda footage. It was an education in mass media. But looking back from the perspective of 30 years, I can see now the education I was really getting was in the logic of a Cold War that was at its heart Manichaean. We're a long way from President Harry Truman's 1947 speech, which created the Cold War. But we are living with its psychological and institutional impact today, and it has brought us as a nation to our own zero line over Afghanistan. You have but to read the pages of the New York Times to realize the crisis for our country that represents. In a remarkably self-effacing 1972 New Yorker article tracing the origins of the devastation caused by America's Vietnam involvement, titled "Reflections Enthralled to Fear," Senator J. William Fulbright bemoaned the intellectual corruption caused by the Truman Doctrine throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. But his shock was in realizing that the actual thinking behind the Cold War was more theological than what could be expected of a secular state institution. To quote from that article, "Our leaders became liberated from the normal rules of evidence and inference when it came to dealing with communism. The effect of the anti-communist ideology was to spare us the task of taking cognizance of the specific facts of specific situations. Our faith liberated us, like the believers of old, from the requirements of empirical thinking. Like medieval theologians, we had a philosophy that explained everything to us in advance, and everything that did not fit could be readily identified as a fraud or a lie or an illusion." Fulbright's reflections are a tragic and largely forgotten commentary on the Cold War. But had he reflected further back into history, he would have discovered that America's assumptions regarding Russia were never empirical. In fact, the assumptions weren't even American at all, but were rooted in messianic 19th century British designs for control of the Eurasian landmass, referred to at the time as mystical imperialism. A recent release of classified documents reveals that Britain's wartime Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had served on the Afghan front as a 23-year-old soldier journalist, was so obsessed with Eurasian conquest, he'd planned on rearming Germany and attacking the Soviet Union right up to the end of World War II. Churchill's operation was shelved, but the mystical medieval crusader theology behind it thrived, and in Afghanistan in the 1980s blossomed into full bloom in the Holy Jihad against Soviet Russia. The narrative for President Obama's so-called AfPak strategy began as a rational endeavor prior to his taking office, but in practice reveals a wealth of traditional attitudes, policy directives, and flawed assumptions left over from the British colonial era that have doomed it from the start. The Brookings Institute's senior AfPak planner, Bruce Riddell, started out by making a serious diplomatic error in a September 2008 interview by suggesting the Afghan government should be pressured to accept the 19th century British-imposed Durand Line, Zero Line, as an international border. At the same time, Pakistani public opinion expressed outrage at the very idea of being lumped together with Afghanistan into any single policy. America's policymakers should perhaps be forgiven for making such fundamental mistakes in their approach to the peoples of Afghanistan and Pakistan. According to some of America's own diplomats, from the opening of official US-Afghan interaction in the 1920s, Washington simply snubbed any and all efforts by Kabul to establish a direct dialogue out of deference to the primacy of British interests in India. In 1995, US Ambassador Leon Pulata and his wife Lila wrote of US envoy Cornelius Van Angert's report on his first semi-official visit to Kabul in 1922. Quote, "Angert's report was factual, objective, and sympathetic to the Afghans. He was able to observe that the Afghan officials and others he met were not savage tribal fanatics, but highly cultivated gentlemen, and that the country was in the midst of a major effort to modernize. Had Angert's report been published, it might have done a great deal to dispel the American misperceptions of Afghanistan. The Department of State, however, promptly placed the classification stamp on it and filed it away." End of quote. The Pulatas go on to relate a follow-up incident in which the roving newscaster Lowell Thomas, piggybacking on Angert's visit, countered Angert's positive report by caricaturing Afghans as, quote, "desperados, who obey neither God nor man, know only the law of the rifle and the knife, and are more savage than the Mongol bandits of Tibet in their all-consuming passion for loot." End of quote. The Pulatas emphasized that not only did Thomas's sensational account transform a few isolated incidents into a damning racist characterization of the Afghan people, it also, quote, "set the style for a long line of journalistic mayhem by later American visitors to Afghanistan." America's direct involvement in Afghanistan's internal affairs is now close to 40 years old, providing the opportunity to track key events and cross-reference them against a variety of sources and declassified documents to reveal how the narrative was woven. It contains a rather unusual but not unique example of the United States backing one group of people in the first decade and in the third decade fighting against the very same people it previously supported. This narrative provides a vivid picture of how easily messages and allies can be created, monopolized, swapped, and altered without anybody really having to explain or take responsibility for the truth. It also demonstrates how once a narrative is created, no matter how inaccurate or laden with one-sided, self-serving propaganda, the institutional assumptions it creates may be virtually impossible to undo. One complicating factor for the United States refers back to what I mentioned earlier about the British, and especially about a company known as the East India Company, beginning around 400 years ago. The company's executives were well known for their draconian pursuit of profits at any cost, were intent on subjugating Afghanistan in any way possible, and obsessed with demonizing Russians whom they saw as far too capable competitors for the jewels of the empire. One of those jewels, the largest diamond in existence, known as the Koh-i-Noor, or the Mountain of Light, once belonged to Ahmad Shah Durrani, the founder of the Afghan royal dynasty that ruled Kabul from 1747 until 1978. It remains the symbol of regional power from Iran to Afghanistan to India, and thanks to the East India Company, today resides as the largest jewel in the crown of England's Queen Elizabeth II. All of this information factors into the Afghan historical narrative and is well known to the people of the region. But the assumptions of sovereignty contained therein remain ignored or simply dismissed by American policymakers as unimportant. The assumptions on which American foreign policy proceed today range from claims that Afghanistan was always a backward state, ruled by warlords, to assertions that the country was never really a nation at all, to proclamations that Afghanistan is unfit for democracy and that it is dangerously naive to think otherwise. Those who knew Afghanistan prior to America's involvement in 2001 understand that these assumptions are wrong. Yet they form the basis of an outdated mythology that underlies the American commitment in the shape of American policy towards the future of Afghanistan. Afghanistan's fierce wars against colonial occupiers are well documented, but the country's efforts to maintain its independence and to establish itself as a modern nation against the constraints and interests posed by these forces are not. According to Vartan Gregorian in his landmark 1969 study, The Emergence of Modern Afghanistan, Afghanistan's identity as a nation first formed in the 16th century with the rise of the mystical Roshaniya movement led by the Sufi poet Bayezid Ansari. One of Ansari's goals was said to be the achievement of equality between men and women. Prior to the British military invasions of the mid-19th century, Afghans were not hostile to the European powers. Of his stay in Kabul in 1832, British explorer Charles Masson reported that a Christian was respectfully referred to as a Katabi, or one of the book. Renowned adventurer and East India Company political officer Alexander Burns wrote home in May of 1832, quote, "The people of this country are kind-hearted and hospitable. They have no prejudice against a Christian and none against our nation." Burns argued correctly that a strong Afghan leader could keep the country together and resist Russian or Persian encroachment, but installing a British puppet would invite disaster. Yet his argument and the goodwill of the Afghan people were lost when London averted its gaze to a secret and privatized war, sound familiar? Conducted by the East India Company, which set the stage for the partition of Afghanistan with the creation of the Durand Line, the Zero Line, in 1893. Ascending the throne in 1919, King Amanullah brought on a period of rapid modernization and democratic change that makes today's Afghan government seem pitiable by comparison. Declaring Afghanistan's independence from Britain, Amanullah's first constitution in 1923 guaranteed universal suffrage, civil rights to all of Afghanistan's minorities, established a legislative assembly and courts with civil, penal, and commercial codes. He prohibited revenge killings and abolished subsidies for tribal chieftains as well as for the royal family. His support for women's equality and the rapid modernization of Afghan society was an open and consistent theme. Amanullah's embrace of modernism, equality, and democracy is often viewed as the cause of his political downfall in 1929. Yet according to Gregorian and numerous other sources, Amanullah's political undoing stemmed mostly from a legacy of British colonialism, which deprived him of the economic foundation necessary to adequately finance his social reforms, and not from any fundamental rejection of his educational and political programs. The same could be said of King Zahir Shah's experiment in democracy from 1963 to 1973. Charles Dunbar, at the time the political officer at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul and later the charge d'affaires during the Soviet occupation, recognized that the failure of the experiment was not a result of Afghanistan's backward tendencies, and some would like to believe, but resided in the people's unmet desire for rapid modernization, which the economy could not support. Dunbar wrote in an end-of-tour memo in August of 1970, quote, "During the 7 years of the experiment, Afghans have become acutely conscious and indeed jealous of the personal freedoms guaranteed them under the 1964 Constitution. Many educated Afghans carry the Constitution in their pockets and quote from it extensively, and it is clear that however much they may criticize the experiment, they have developed some faith in the document as a guardian of their rights." End of quote. We've been involved in the Afghan story now for over 30 years, and we've come to see it in a very different light than most analysts, and certainly those connected to what is referred to as the triumphalist narrative of American foreign and military policy. One of those triumphalists was Congressman Charlie Wilson, who was labeled a hero in America's first Afghan war for his role in helping to bring on the collapse of the Soviet Union. From our experience, Charlie Wilson was not a hero. The U.S. response to a growing Soviet influence in Afghanistan in the 1970s and to their eventual invasion was a cleverly calculated revenge for what the United States suffered in Vietnam, and unfortunately little else. Far from being a surprise to American authorities as claimed at the time, Washington was well informed in advance of Soviet designs as well as of their efforts to avoid what the Kremlin knew would be a catastrophe. Once drawn in, the Soviet system could not adjust rapidly to events in Afghanistan, but instead relied on its own triumphalist narrative from World War II to keep convincing itself that it could stay the course. Soviet authorities we spoke to in 1980 in Moscow did not see the end of detente, the new right, or the Reagan military buildup coming. The real genius of America's first war in Afghanistan in the 1980s was not to defeat the Soviets and drive them home. It was to lure the Soviets into an Afghan trap and hold them there for as long as possible, while at the same time creating a narrative that claimed the exact opposite, that American assistance to those fiercely religious freedom fighters was intended to drive the Soviet Union out. This narrative proved effective at raising the stakes on America's contribution to the war from $5 million a year to numerous billions. And who was this narrative for? Certainly not the Soviets, who knew that their geriatric party leadership had made a colossal mistake and that their disintegrating system was caving in without the help of the United States and its allies. Not the Afghans, whose president told me in an interview in the spring of 1981 that the Soviets would leave as soon as the US stopped funding terrorists from Pakistan. And not General Zia-ul Haq and his Pakistani military, who were using American money to advance a nuclear agenda and an extremist cause, not only inside Afghanistan, but inside Pakistan as well. No, this narrative was for Americans, to build up political support for a campaign to punish the Soviet Union for America's miscalculations in Vietnam, and at the same time open the door for radical Islamist extremism to undermine Soviet rule in the oil-rich southern Soviet republics. So how does this conflicting and contradictory narrative affect the Obama administration's efforts to establish a permanent presence in Afghanistan after the bulk of American troops are withdrawn in 2013? In order to understand our perspective on the origins of America's role in Crossing Zero and why things just don't seem to work the way they're advertised, we'd like to take you back to our first involvement with Afghanistan in a short video, God willing, and how we came to see today's narrative as it was being written.
In Afghanistan, rebel attacks on Soviet and Soviet-led local military forces appear to have increased during the past several weeks.
CBS News struggled for weeks with the footage I brought back from Kabul on that first trip in 1981. We were told by the CBS producer that the front office was under intense pressure to conform to the official narrative established by Washington. They finally compromised by comparing my eyewitness account to Soviet propaganda.
Shortly before these reports, the Soviet-supported Afghan government authorized an independent American film team to visit the country. CBS News correspondent Steve Young, recently returned from Moscow, put the American film together with Soviet propaganda film for this report.
The truth of the April Revolution. In this film, we show everything as it actually is.
This
film made by Soviets for Soviets does not show the Afghan guerrillas resisting the Soviet-installed regime in their country. But the film did provide one of the few glimpses of life in Afghanistan cities since the Soviet invasion, until an American TV crew was allowed in, the first American journalists to be officially welcomed in 16 months.
It is not as active and as volatile as we expected it to be. Perhaps we hit it on 10 good days. Perhaps the reason why they granted us the permission to come when they did was the feeling that they had reached a level of security where they could allow an American team in.
The Afghanistan that Paul Fitzgerald and his crew saw last month was much the same view the Soviets have been showing their own people. In Kabul, the capital, people seem to be going about business as usual, not a Russian face in sight.
What CBS wanted was the official narrative that Dan Rather had presented to the country a year earlier, that the Soviets were bent on controlling Persian Gulf oil and that the U.S. wasn't doing enough to stop them.
America seems to be asleep. It doesn't seem to realize that if Afghanistan goes and the Russians go over to the Gulf, that in a very short time it's going to be the turn of the United States as well.
In our report, CBS chose not to air Afghan President Barbara Karmal, citing the conditions under which the Soviets would withdraw.
Anytime that a reliable and a convincible guarantee is given on the part of the neighboring countries, Pakistan and Iran, and the United States of America and China, that there would be no recurrence of any sign of aggression, provocation, and interferences into the internal affairs of Afghanistan, the limited military contingents of the Soviet troops would return to their peaceful land. Otherwise, if these interferences, provocations, and aggressions, particularly from the Pakistani soil, continue to exist, then the limited contingents of the Soviet troops will remain in the country.
This is ABC News Nightline.
It's more than 3 years since the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and installed its...
Our return trip in 1983 was to follow up on Karmal's statement. Was this just more Soviet propaganda put out to weaken America's resolve in the fight against the Soviet Empire? Or was it true? And if so, what would it take for the Soviets to go home?
The side has gained much ground and attempts at negotiation have gotten nowhere. In effect, a military and political stalemate. Under these circumstances, earlier this month, a television news team headed by American freelance journalist Paul Fitzgerald was granted permission to spend 10 days in Marxist-controlled Afghanistan. For part of that time, they were accompanied by one of America's leading experts on crisis negotiation, Professor Roger Fisher of Harvard University. Here now is their exclusive report narrated by Paul Fitzgerald.
Roger Fisher of the Harvard Negotiation Project had already been approached by the Soviets when we offered him the opportunity to go with us to Kabul. And the results were startling.
I was in Moscow in October, and a Soviet friend of mine spent several days trying to get a hold of me, and when he did, he then said, "How do we get out of Afghanistan?" And I said, "That's the last question I expected you ask." He said, "By we, I mean Americans as well as Russians." I said, "It's a lot easier for us to get out than it is for you." And that was there. And then when Paul Fitzgerald shortly thereafter said, would I go with him on another film trip, I said, well, put me down for a visa if it comes along and I'll see. And since then, I've met with Russians in Washington and talked a little about the problem. And then when the invitation came through, indicated we could talk with people, I said, why not? So we went over.
How is a negotiated settlement possible?
Well, no one can know what the Soviet Union is going to do. We can fight the war politically and militarily. The way to influence the Soviet Union is to come up and give them a choice, give them a chance to get out, give them a chance for a neutral, non-aligned Afghanistan, which is not an anti-Soviet government, not a pro-Soviet government, but one which will have no military bases from either side. The UN is working on that. They're going back to Geneva in June. I talked with yesterday in New York with both Pakistan and Afghan ambassadors and with UN officials. I think there's a fair chance. No one can be sure. And I don't think the Soviet Union themselves know exactly what they're going to do, but
we ought to construct and see if we can develop an option that serves them up, a golden bridge, a way to get out without a military defeat. We leave a coalition government. Right now they're leaving, I think they're opening it up. I think that Mr. Karmal is being downplayed. They're making it possible. He would resign if necessary. I'm absolutely confident he would resign.
You're talking about the Prime Minister?
The President would resign.
President, yes.
President Karmal would resign if necessary to help get a coalition acceptable government, and that's the kind of thing we have to be working toward.
Needless to say, the Golden Bridge was never offered because Charlie Wilson's war was gaining political traction as a vindication for Vietnam and a justification for Reagan's World War II-sized arms buildup. Everybody climbed on board the effort to hurt the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, apparently without a care that once started, the war could never be turned off.
It was such a heroic effort. It was so black and white. It was so good guys against the bad guys. They rose up and vanquished the evil invader. This is going to go down as the finest chapter in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. There's no question about that. They just didn't make any mistakes.
The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Towers was the first outward sign that some very big mistakes had been made.
We didn't look ahead to the monster this was going to create after the war. We really created a monster in Afghanistan. We've created fundamentalist, heavily armed fundamentalist factions that could never have achieved the kind of military capability without our support.
The monster that Sig Harrison saw created in the 1980s grew far beyond the Afghan war and Charlie Wilson's desire to avenge Vietnam.
Islamic fundamentalists from all over the world hooked into these groups, got trained with our help through these groups, and now they're doing a lot of things we don't like.
So what was Charlie Wilson thinking when he pushed the billion-dollar program to arm and train fundamentalist factions when the Soviets really wanted to get out, at least as early as 1982?
It was that if we could get them something sophisticated to be able to at least destroy the Soviet tanks and to be able to defend themselves against the Soviet helicopter gunships, that they conceivably could drive the Soviets from their land. It was a great 10 years.
It was a great 10 years for Charlie Wilson, but a bad 30 years for the Afghan people and American journalism. Because hardly anyone realizes today that the biggest mistake of all had been the charade to simply ignore Soviet efforts to leave Afghanistan while claiming that Charlie Wilson's war was being waged to drive them out. We all know that there are at least two sides to every story. For every white paper put out by the US government for public consumption, there is a corresponding black paper laying out the true intentions of the policy. Throughout the Cold War, this division between the known and the unknown, between the transparency of light and the darkness of secrecy, played havoc with the domestic political narrative and the very concept of what was real and what wasn't. In fact, it could be said to have laid the foundation for a form of magical thinking from which the political process has never recovered. To quote again from Senator William Fulbright, "The truly remarkable thing about this Cold War psychology is the totally illogical transfer of the burden of proof from those who make charges to those who question it. In this frame of reference, communists are guilty until proved innocent or simply by definition. Rational men cannot deal with each other on this basis." But mystical imperialism is not by definition rational. Since the Cold War, our medieval theologians have moved this irrational process beyond communism and finally back to Islam, where it began with the Crusades in 1099. During the 1980s, we chose to take on this psychology, and we learned that behind the exoteric curtain was a deeper esoteric tradition that was indeed the product of the medieval mind. Liz will now explain what we came to know and how we came to know it. Thank you.
The first thing an academic tells you when you mention the mystical side of the Afghanistan story is you shouldn't go there. The study of foreign policy cannot be seen as having been motivated by anything other than rational reasons and measured by the metrics of quantitative analysis. How then to explain why George W. Bush claimed that God told him to invade Iraq? How then to explain the American military's fascination with medieval knighthoods like the Knights Templar? How then to explain the use of New Testament biblical passages engraved on the gun sights of American troops in Afghanistan? How then to explain Goldman Sachs' chief executive claiming that bankers were doing God's work as he defended the return of massive profits to banks? How then to explain the American exceptionalism that President Obama has embraced, where the United States gets to do anything it pleases because America is always right, no matter what it does? People have heard about the holy warriors of the Muslim world, but what most Americans are unaware of is that the mystical component of the warriors who fight for America, and how that component has been setting the agenda for American politics from behind the scenes. In Maine, they use the expression, "you can't get there from here," to explain this kind of disconnect. I'm using it to make the point that you can't get exoteric Afghanistan unless you understand the esoteric, and you can't understand the esoteric without accepting the personal. In researching for our books, we discovered a trove of esoteric history, starting with the British. It revolves around mystical imperialism, a term first used to describe 19th century British efforts to colonize the non-Christian world by applying Judeo-Christian ethics and philosophies. Simply put, mystical imperialism rationalizes the expansion of a nation's authority by conquest over other nations, by infusing a sense of the divine into the raw politics of empire building. Today's practitioners of American mystical imperialism are a hardened core of ideological defense intellectuals and military officers who infuse their own esoteric and religious beliefs into Washington policy making. These individuals can trace their philosophical DNA back to the 19th century European secret societies who were known to be involved in espionage on both British and Russian sides. Reflected in the fictional Masonic exploits of Rudyard Kipling's Two Soldiers in The Man Who Would Be King, the hidden or occult game for control of Afghanistan and Central Asia was a factor in the foreign policy of the 19th century for the British and the Russians, and continues to this day through the United States. Afghanistan was the ancient home of the prophet Zoroaster, who set forth in the Avesta the worship of a single wise God who fought against evil. It was the Avesta that became the foundation document for the Judeo-Christian war of light against dark. It was 19th century Afghanistan and its surroundings that provided a mystical underpinning to what today is dryly regarded as geopolitics. Described as the world island by early 20th century British geostrategist Halford Mackinder, Russia's position at the center of the Eurasian landmass rivaled Britain's as an island fortress. Mackinder foresaw Russia expanding with ferocity beyond its borders. From the outset, a Russian dominance of Central Asia spawned nightmares for the British of an apocalyptic horde sweeping from the Russian steppe across Europe, which had to be stopped at any cost. Henry Wallace, Franklin Roosevelt's vice president, supported the expedition in 1934 with the intention of establishing a spiritual settlement in the Himalayas. Wallace expressed his enthusiasm for the plan known as the Shambhala Project, stating that, quote, "The political situation in this part of the world is always rendered especially intriguing by the effect on it of ancient prophecies, traditions, and alike," end quote. Wallace anticipated that those prophecies were at last coming due. Hidden to human eyes, Shambhala was said by the Tibetan Buddhists to lie somewhere near Tibet and would finally be revealed at the end of time. Others believed it was hidden in the valleys of the Pamir mountain range in Afghanistan. This was the Shambhala that concealed the lost wisdom, the secrets of immortality, and the beginnings of the human race. Adolf Hitler sent an expedition to Tibet and Afghanistan in 1939 in the hopes of finding proof of Aryan links to Germany in Central Asia. From Halford Mackinder at the beginning of the 20th century to the American Cold Warrior James Burnham, the godfather of neoconservatism, to Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Grand Master of American foreign policy, Eurasia represented the central basis for American global primacy in a world defined by Manichaean opposites. In a 1945 Partisan Review article titled Lenin's Heir, Burnham, while still at the Office of Strategic Services, infused his apocalyptic views with mystical allusions to the Eurasian heartland as the magnetic core of Soviet power, comparing it to the mystical reality of the one of Neoplatonism, whose unstoppable progression descends through the stages of mind, soul, and matter towards its ultimate destination beyond the Eurasian boundaries and through appeasement and infiltration, England and the United States. As an anti-communist ideology, Burnham's warnings about the inevitability of Soviet expansion ring like a medieval theologian's incantation throughout Winston Churchill's 1946 Iron Curtain speech, which established the need for a Cold War against the Soviet Union. 26 years later, Senator William Fulbright would realize that only because of the disastrous outcome of Vietnam was there any willingness to re-examine the basic assumptions of the Cold War. The 1972 Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, known as SALT, would spring from this rational reassessment, as would the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and eventually SALT II. But because of National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski's unyielding hostility toward compromise with the Soviet Union over Afghanistan, President Carter would ask the Senate to delay consideration of the treaty. That treaty would never be passed, and the United States would begin a long, slow march into what Burnham described as the magnetic core of the world island. Our involvement in the Afghan story started in 1979 when we began production of a documentary titled Arms Race and the Economy, A Delicate Balance, for Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network. If anybody was engaged in a mystical crusade to change America, it was Pat Robertson, and working on the documentary opened our eyes to the drastic philosophical divisions emerging in American society. During the next months, numerous experts, including economist John Kenneth Galbraith, lent their experience to our understanding of the damage that a massive diversion of tax dollars and investment would represent to the civilian economy. Galbraith insisted that accelerated defense spending and renewing the Cold War, as the new right was demanding, would destroy the civilian economy. He was convinced that the Cold War had already made America more like Stalin's Soviet Union, ideologically rigid and ruled by a military-industrial academic establishment suspended from reality. But by the time our program aired, the argument was no longer whether our government should call a halt to the nuclear arms race and reinvest in the civilian economy. The December 27, 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had rolled back the narrative to 1947, the Truman Doctrine to Churchill and Burnham's mystical medieval enchantment, and the psychological warfare campaign necessary to bring it back to life was about to begin. The point man for that campaign was President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. As an acolyte of Mackinder, Brzezinski understood the mystically imperial nature of what America was embarking on. Because of Mackinder's assumptions about Russia, Brzezinski believed the Soviet takeover of Afghanistan and its pursuit of global dominance was foreordained and not subject to rational empirical observations. Brzezinski began dialoguing with the Chinese and the Pakistanis in 1978 over Soviet influence in Afghanistan and how to respond to it. 6 months before the Soviet invasion in 1979, Brzezinski had President Carter sign a finding enabling propaganda support to the insurgency that Brzezinski stated could draw the Soviets into their own Vietnam War. When the Kabul government expelled the Western media 1 month after the Soviet invasion, we jumped at the chance to get behind this propaganda and break the news blackout. Once we had secured the visas, a friend in TV news connected us to CBS News foreign editor Peter Larkin, an intense and driven veteran of the Vietnam War. I was 6 months pregnant with our daughter Alyssa at the time and decided not to go on the trip, but I did participate in all the negotiations and preparations at CBS headquarters in New York. What Paul saw in Kabul was indeed in stark contrast to the picture that was playing on CBS News. After struggling with the footage for a month, as you have already seen, CBS finally aired a segment about the Soviet troops that Paul didn't see. What followed was a decade-long education in the major media's restructuring of the narrative that brought us back to CBS and ABC, PBS, and the top echelons at UN headquarters. Frustrated with getting nowhere and changing the official narrative, we began to look at our story from a personal perspective, to understand the voice that had called us to the Afghan story in the first place. That decision triggered a shift in our consciousness, and we started writing screenplays. That's when we saw Oliver Stone's film JFK. It was Oliver's decision to include the involvement of an esoteric secret society with deeper motives that resonated with us. In our research into the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1170, an enterprise largely run by Paul's FITZGERALD family, we discovered reasons why some secret societies might have had an historic conflict with JFK's ancestors. The Voice was to be a dramatized exploration of the deeper motive behind these secret societies, when our 10-year-old daughter told us about a dream she'd had. In Alyssa's dream, she was visited by Paul's deceased father, who was accompanied by a man wearing a Scottish plaid suit with bell-bottom trousers and a matching hat, who told Alyssa he was 800 years old. We took Alyssa's dream as an opportunity to look more deeply into Paul's family history. Paul knew that his family had come to Ireland as mercenaries 800 years before in the service of Richard de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke in Wales. We also took this as an opportunity to use the dream as a dramatic vehicle to tell a multi-dimensional historical epic. We then developed the Voice research paper with the hope that Oliver would become interested in it too. But he wanted our life story instead. We accepted that Oliver's direction was the right course to follow. As we began our research for the Afghanistan screenplay, we discovered that many of the official US documents preceding the crisis were being declassified. As we built our script around those documents, we found that the renewed Cold War of the 1970s against the Soviet Union had been referred to as a Manichaean war of light against dark. We also found, to our shock, an appeal from Congress to the Mujahideen to use their mystical communications network to curtail the drug trade, which was growing beyond control. Then, we unexpectedly discovered a connection that brought us back full circle to Alyssa's dream. While going through a book by an ex-CIA agent about British efforts in Afghanistan in the 19th century, we found photos of two Americans who played a prominent role in the shadows. One of these men was dressed wearing a Scottish plaid suit with bell-bottom trousers and a matching hat. Alyssa confirmed that day when she came home from school that Alexander Gardner, an Irish-American mercenary wearing a clan uniform of his own design, was the man from her dream. She had somehow tapped a synchronicity about our Afghan adventure that we were not yet aware of. When Oliver asked us to connect the esoteric background of The Voice with the Afghanistan screenplay, we found ourselves laboring over these mystical aspects and how to merge the past, present, and future into a coherent story. In writing the script, our CBS experience began to emerge as a 20th century version of Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, with the CBS News editor cast as Inspector Javert, who with all his resources was determined to bring the Soviets to justice for what he believed they did to him in Vietnam. In our factual Afghanistan screenplay, his part was real and demanding because the burden of proof was on us. But in the voice novel, his character had matured into the future as a victim of his own propaganda. And like Javert, he was forced to face a world that had grown bigger than his Manichaean system could cope with. Through the narrative in the voice that was published in 2001, the character of Alyssa, as our daughter, finally resolves the conflict between the demanding news editor and Paul, her father. It was the storyteller Oliver Stone in 1992 who got us back on the Afghan course, and in that process crossed us over into the telling of our personal story. We can now see clearly that the weaving back and forth of the screenplay and the novel had become a way of understanding the multidimensional. But we still had a long way to go to complete the quest that we found ourselves in by choosing to peer behind the veil of superpower confrontation. Flash forward to December 23rd, 2011. Our daughter, Alyssa, tells us that her friend from San Francisco is visiting nearby with her father, and they are coming to our Christmas party. When she tells us their last name is Larkin, I mentioned that the only Larkin we'd ever met was Peter Larkin, who worked at CBS News, who was wounded in Vietnam, and hired us to go to Afghanistan in 1981. Alyssa tells us it must be the same person because he worked at CBS News and still suffers from the wounds acquired in Vietnam. We were shocked, having lost touch with him back in 1983. Having the former CBS News foreign editor, the man who launched us into our 30-year saga, walk through the front door of our home just as Santa emerged to hand out gifts was beyond surreal. All Peter could talk about was how wonderful our daughter is and how much she had helped his daughter to settle in San Francisco. For him, Afghanistan was only a distant memory, a campaign fought and won, and now he'd moved on. At the end of the evening, as Peter and I talked, he marveled that he had actually met Alyssa 30 years earlier in utero. As Paul walked Peter to the door to leave, Paul said to him, "If I never thanked you for sending me to Afghanistan, I am thanking you now." To which Peter responded instantly, "If I never thanked you for going to Afghanistan, I am thanking you now." It was as if the novelized encounter between Paul and Peter through Alyssa, which had been foreshadowed in The Voice in 2001, had been brought into reality. Our personal story that we had started to write for Oliver Stone 20 years ago had finally written itself. It was an astonishing alpha and omega moment, produced by our daughters that unexpectedly completed a journey begun 30 years ago between two competing storytellers. But the propaganda narrative broadcast by the mainstream media throughout the 1980s to support Zbigniew Brzezinski's Manichaean geostrategy of good versus evil towards the Soviet Union remains in place. Like the Cold War itself, it is an obsolete model of statecraft whose time has come and gone and is now handicapping America when the U.S. can least afford it. Call it fate, call it karma, or simply blowback. America's dilemma in Afghanistan today began as an act of mystical imperialism when Brzezinski encouraged the rise of Islamic extremism in Central Asia to defeat his nemesis, the Soviet Union. And in a twist of fate, since 9/11, Brzezinski has been the consummate rationalist, calling for an end to irrational hostilities towards the Muslim world in order to counter the spread of Islamic extremism. We can only hope that as one who has experienced the seduction of mystical imperial power and lived to witness the unintended consequences of its use, Zbigniew Brzezinski will succeed in throwing cold water on the current crop of overheated mystical imperialists who are busy yet again in cooking up their delusions of grandeur. Thank you.
What's a rational way for this country to proceed? Capital R on rational.
Capital R on rational. Well, I think that one of the biggest problems we've had over the years is to see what we think of as rational people doing irrational things. And I mean,
self-proclaimed rational people.
Well, the fact is that I think we're all guilty of irrationalism at one point or another. Okay, I just think that we have this thing called mystical imperialism, which is like institutionalized irrationalism. You can look, and I mentioned in my speech the fact that Afghanistan is just a perfect example of chapter and verse where you can go in and you can see exactly what happened and how it happened and how the narrative was then constructed to make everyone think that this was an overt act of aggression by a Soviet Union that was resurgent, coming forward and going to go into the Middle East and conquer. These guys were falling apart. We interviewed in research for our book, we interviewed Paul Warnke, who had written the SALT II treaty and negotiated it, and it was also involved in SALT I as well. And he went with Robert McNamara to the Soviet Union. Vietnam was a real problem for the United States. I mean, it was a real, it shook the institutional self-confidence to the core in this country about what they could do and how they could accomplish it. Pentagon really thought they were going to walk into Vietnam and they'd brush the French aside, what the French had done there, and just simply take over the country with the use of McNamara's statistics and strategies that he had developed during World War II, take it over.
Just as an aside, would you call Vietnam mystical imperialism?
Well,
I would say that yes, that's exactly
well,
right. That's a good example.
I think I'd like to state that every war is mystical imperialism. That's the point. When the British were practicing, it was called that in the 19th century. Today we've been led to believe that this idea, and what is mystical imperialism? It is literally using the power of the divine. That is exactly the idea. Who gives, if you go back to the Old Testament, which is a foundation book for the idea of the practice of war. This is viewed by militarists as the principle is to get God on your side, and this is taken quite literally. The idea that when you win, God is on your side. When you lose, it means you've done something wrong. God is not on your side anymore, and you have to work to make God come back to you. This concept, I think, in the 20th century, we were led to believe that, and of course the whole idea of the Enlightenment and rationalism had tried to sell the idea that there had been this separation. Of course, the foundation principle in this country, the separation of church and state. And yet, when you actually look at what Zbigniew Brzezinski was doing, he was actually practicing, that's the whole point, mystical imperialism, when he decided that he was going to lure the Soviets into Afghanistan, to trap them there, and win the Cold War. And as far as he was concerned, that was absolutely justifiable, totally. Now, how else can you explain it except as an act of, the word, I guess, irrationality doesn't address mystical imperialism as well as mystical imperialism addresses itself. Okay, I think irrationality, I think, has been tainted in this, this sort of, if it's rational, it's good, if it's irrational, it's bad. That's not the right way to look, it's different. And that's part of why we bring in this quality of Brzezinski, who today is the consummate rationalist, arguing that the current crop of mystical imperialists are all wrong about Islam. He's the rationalist today. That's what we have to recognize. Any one of these individuals can turn into the imperialist and then become rational about something else. When the Soviets were being drawn into Afghanistan, most Americans just didn't know it. Nobody was watching them. It was happening then. That's our point. It was happening full-blown, actually. Because that's why when we first got into the story and looked at the fact that there was this phony narrative over here, and there was this ground truth over here, and there was no relationship between the two. And it didn't matter. We could not get that story out at any meaningful level.
The real,
go ahead.
The real story is that this country did a superb excellent job of sucking the Soviet Union in.
Absolutely.
And they're, you know.
That's an act of pride.
Yeah, I mean, they're to be congratulated.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And
well, the man who opposed the 1978 coup, Hafizullah Amin, had been educated at Columbia. He was here twice. He was here the first time, he got his master's, and the second time he came back, and he was sponsored by the American Friends of the Middle East, which is essentially a CIA front. And he went back to Afghanistan, and the KGB said, "You've been taking money from the CIA." And he went, "Oh yeah, I took money from the CIA, but I was only doing it because I was telling them that they were getting influence over me, but they really weren't." You're right. Well, you know, there are other books that have been published, aside from ours, in which it's indicated that there was one done by a guy by the name of Richard Mahoney. It was done a number of years ago. He just re-released it in 2011, in which he interviewed a number of government officials who stated that Hafizullah Amin was not only a CIA asset, but he was also working for the ISI. Now the thing is that 5 years ago, how many Americans would you ask, know what even the ISI is? It's Pakistan's intelligence service. They have been involved. Now, you've got to look back to the British in the 19th century and who did the majority of the fighting for them in the development, the creation of the ISI was a British creation, as was the CIA. Go see a movie like The Good Shepherd as an example. They'll give you an example of exactly chapter and verse where the British took the Americans aside and they took the Pakistanis aside and they said, all right, we want you to get together because you're going to advance the empire. And that empire is a mystical empire. And the whole objective of this, which spans many centuries, is to control Eurasia. That is the mystical destination of this. And you also have the counter to that. You also have a lot of Russian mystics from the 19th century, early 20th century, who believe the same thing, Blavatsky and Madame Blavatsky, and that's what the Roosevelt's vice president, Henry Wallace, he joined in. He was the next generation of people who picked up on the Gurdjieff and Blavatsky's Shambhala. They were going off to Shambhala. And the CIA was involved in it too. That episode where that Liz mentioned about the Germans went and posed an expedition to Tibet and Afghanistan to see if to find the roots of their Aryan ancestry there. That was very real. And you know, there are Afghans who claim that is the case, who met with Hitler and met with the German foreign minister, what's his name? Ribbentrop, to discuss this. Okay, we've been told by that when Ribbentrop was told that there was proof that the Afghans were the predecessors of the Aryans, that they actually that Hitler wanted to meet with the Afghans and find out exactly what that was all about. So I mean, this sort of thing, and the guy Ernst Schaefer, the guy who did the exploration into Tibet for Hitler, actually was a very close friend of an American by the name of Brooke Dolan. Brooke Dolan had actually done, in the early 30s, had done one of these expeditions to Tibet with him. They put together a number of different institutions, museums and universities, a mystical tour. In fact, there's a book that was written a few years ago called Tournament of Shadows. And it's an excellent, if you're interested and you're drawn to this particular aspect of it, about this part of the world. Okay, and the fact is that you know the thing about the mystical aspect of it and the irrational versus the rational. You can say, I mean, I don't consider myself to be particularly irrational, and I don't consider myself to be mystical. Okay, but every so often these sort of things occur, which are absolutely confounding. Okay, and this event that happened when our daughter told us on the morning of the Christmas party, you know, there were 35, 40 people coming to this Christmas party, and here's this one guy of all the gin joints and all the towns in all the world that this guy came to for Christmas, he came to ours. And it was just a phenomenal, it's like, how is this happening? How is this happening? So
you couldn't experience something like that and say, oh,
our daughter is not in the news business, his daughter's not in the news business. It was one of those things where, you know, just one thing connected to another thing connected, and it happened that way.
Divine intervention.
divine intervention.
Well, and we have had a lot of those things happening, but this is the one that kind of gave us the alpha and omega of it.
For many years, for 30 years, all I could think to myself is this: how is this ever going to end? And what did I do by getting that, by thinking up, getting permission to go to Afghanistan when nobody else could go? Okay.
And the ending walked into our front door.
Walked right in the door.
And said, if I thanked Paul for going. I mean, that was like the end of the script.
It was, as I said,
Yeah.
I don't consider myself to be particularly mystical, but that was
in our face. Oh, Christina, you had your hand.
Well, I'm just really interested in your comments about Brzezinski because last year he was giving a talk at some think tank or something, and he said something really interesting about how in the past the ultimate power elite was the United States. But now, unfortunately, he was sort of implying, we've got the Asian power elite coming up, and then we have the Russian power elites, and on top of that, the people are waking up. So this is going to create all. So I was just curious to know how you would place within that context that he's, the competing, maybe it's the competing mystical imperialists,
Christina, this is one where he said it's become easier physically to kill 1 million people than it is to control 1 million people.
Right. No, well, I don't remember him saying that, but I just remember him saying that people are waking up and this is, control, we've lost control of people. So I just wonder, given that view that he was, his sudden rationality about the Muslims,
right?
How that fits into that.
Well, I think that it fits in that that Brzezinski is not, that he actually satisfied his mystical imperialism by feeling he contributed to the destruction of the Soviet Union. He resolved his own, Poland was taken over by the Soviets, and I think that there's a lot of people in Eastern Europe, obviously, who had certain attitudes towards the Soviet Union in the issues of World War II. He was certainly well known for being an absolute Russophobe who really wanted the destruction of the Soviet Union. He did not, in fact,
he has Russia.
Yeah, but he hates Russia too. But But I think that he invested himself in the United States. I think that's where he sees himself. He sees himself as an American. He sees himself as helping the American elites take over the world. He did this great thing when he helped destroy the Soviet Union. He was the mastermind behind it. And they didn't get it. They were supposed to turn the world into this new place that they would then control. And they've lost it. And he's tearing his hair out.
He states it pretty clearly in his book, The Grand Chessboard, that he's at odds with the Anglo-Saxon domination.
The Templars.
With the Anglo-Saxon, and that's what we kind of found out with the Voice, okay? That you've got these competing knighthoods that came out of the Crusades. You have the Teutonic knighthood, the German knighthood. You have the Knights of Malta. Today, the Knights of Malta. At the time, they were the Knights Hospitaller, who were the original group that formed, okay, prior to the Crusades. And they were there to basically provide safety for pilgrims who were going to the Holy Land. And of course, then the Knights Templar, who were something else entirely. And that's where all the Da Vinci Code and all that stuff comes out about exactly who they are and what they were doing. That they are somehow descendants of the Merovingians, who are descendants of the House of David, who are just assuming their rightful role of taking over humanity.
Just a little point, though, about the Knight Templar. Wild Bill Donovan, who created the CIA, the OSS, the CIA, he referred to his original agents as Knights Templars. That's how overt this esoteric secret society component is in the intelligence communities. And it's in all of them. This is not just the U.S. This is certainly in the British and the Russian. It's in all of them. In the German, everything is involved with this hidden quality. And if you don't understand the motivations coming from that, I am convinced that one of Brzezinski's reasons for hating Russia is because of its split from Rome. He is a very Roman Catholic. And the Byzantine split, they're heretics too, just like the Templars are. So that creates these schisms that, and when you want power to come back to the Rome, you don't like Russia.
Yeah, he goes out of his way to state in that book that the relationship with Britain really should be stopped. It really should be. That alliance,
And that's
an
an
Anglo-American
yeah.
alliance,
That's
is really
his-
messing up America's role in the world.
Right.
Okay? Yes, Tom?
He's also somewhat outspoken about Israel as well. When,
Yes, he is.
When they were talking about bombing Iran, that they'd have to fly over Iraq, and we'd have to shoot them down and that sort of thing. Hasn't he provided Israel with the perfect existential bully by stoking up Muslim fundamentalism around the world?
Well, he certainly has. He certainly has contributed to that, yeah.
But interestingly enough,
Unintended consequences.
Yeah, we would call it that. I wouldn't think that would have been his motivation was to destroy the Soviet Union.
No, I'm just saying he's handed them a perfect excuse
Yes,
to go
but
viral.
that's what we're saying. Now we're saying, Brzezinski, you know the unintended consequence of what you did with mystical imperialism. Would you please say something to the current crop of guys?
I think he is saying something, and I don't think they're listening.
No, because he's not.
He's trying to redirect the ship of state, and the fact is that I don't think there really are all that many people who are qualified at that level who understand the mystical aspects of all of this process. That mystical in the sense that they are not bound by the common everyday thing that all the rest of us are. They are above and beyond the frame.
Well,
yeah, it's like this what we were talking about earlier, this 0.11, 0.000% who have all this money, who have half the wealth of the world right now, and are basically free to do with it whatever they choose. They can create reality.
Well, that is exactly what in fact, one of our neighbors told us recently that he was involved with esoteric finance. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's a form of, it's a way of approaching the financial world, basically, literally, calls it esoteric. The derivatives that were created were referred to as esoteric finance. And what it means, basically, is that you get to create anything you want, and you basically put it out because you have the structures, you have the credibility, you have all these systems in place that you can take something that has value, over here, and then reformulate it into 1,000 pieces over here, and claim each 1,000 pieces has the same individual value, and then sell it on that basis, which is exactly what they did. Right. They call that esoteric finance.
And as long as somebody buys it, it's real.
So it's esoteric finance, but it's also math controlling everything.
Yeah.
Oh, it's really math. Math is it. Math is what is controlling the world right now.
What they call it is derivatives.
Yes, they call it the
there are
credit
trillions of dollars in derivatives.
The derivatives,
right. And they're absolutely.
And these people are geniuses from MIT who come up with these equations that create all of these possibilities. And nobody else understands it because it's so infinitely complex. And we're all willing to sort of say, okay, you're the math genius, But these are immoral people.
Well, what
incredibly immoral.
You see, but what they are,
but it's math that's controlled.
But you see, it's just like what happened this past week when the man from Goldman Sachs did his mea culpa in the New York Times, and apparently Mayor Bloomberg was so upset. He ran over to Goldman Sachs to tell them even God couldn't make this place look good. All right? No, he was so upset that his Goldman Sachs was being criticized, okay? So that idea that they don't see it that way, they literally are.
Yeah, could you briefly comment on the existence of some no man's land between Pakistan and Afghanistan called Walla Walla Corridor? If that exists, I'd like to speak to
The Joaquin Corridor?
It's called the Joaquin, I heard Walla Walla, I'm not sure what.
Yeah, I didn't know it's the Joaquin Corridor.
Who controls it? Who controls it?
Well, it's still technically part of Afghanistan, but that was one of those things that was derived over an agreement between Russia and England and China.
What year?
I think it finalized in 1907, I think. Okay, but Afghanistan, if you look at a map, Louis Dupree's got these great maps in his book called Afghanistan, the American anthropologist, and he's got one map where he shows the northern descent of the Russians towards Afghanistan, who are taking over into South Central Asia, and the upward western, east, I'm sorry, towards the east actually, from India, of the British. Okay, taking those provinces bit by bit by bit by bit. And China was involved at the time, and Tibet, the issue over Tibet's independence was involved at the time. And so they finally came to these grand decisions over who was going to control what territories, and this went on from the late 1890s until until the creation of Pakistan. They were still doing it with the separation of East Pakistan from West Pakistan, and the issue now with Kashmir, as an example, between the Pakistanis and the Indians. So you have all these tribal rivalries that have been going on now that are basically external forces. These are the great powers imposing these on regional tribal groups. And in some cases, as the Durand Line, it's completely artificial. It was done completely for the convenience of the British Empire. Durand basically laid down, he had a map, and he says, all right, he invites the Afghan Amir in and says, you administer everything on your side of the border, and we'll administer everything on our side of the border, on this line right here. And the fact is that the English made it pretty clear that they wanted to go over the border and take all of Afghanistan and basically cut it up into ethnicities. But they couldn't do it. They tried it. They tried it on two separate occasions. They tried it in the First Anglo-Afghan War and were thrown out, in which they lost their entire army. And then in the Second Anglo-Afghan War, they seized all of Afghanistan, but then realized that the same thing over a period of a couple of years was happening. They were paying off this tribal chieftain and that tribal chieftain, and it was becoming so expensive they just simply couldn't maintain it. But they did. Up until 1947, they still maintained something like 25,000 troops in that northwest frontier area. They occupied it permanently. They had a policy of what was called butcher and bolt. The English would go into a village, into a Pashtun village. They would butcher everybody in the village, and then they'd bolt before they could get caught. That was the way, that was the policy by which they tried to control the region. Yes.
Can you argue that America's involvement in the last 10 years in Afghanistan is just as simple as controlling the resources, like the Caspian pipeline and the drugs and the lithium, I think it's that they discovered, and and as far as the people who are really behind the invasion, they don't think there's anything. They don't think anything went wrong. Everything is just going as well as it can be, and a few thousand lives and the erosion of our economy is irrelevant. In fact, also plays into their thinking.
But one of the big mistakes that people made about the Soviet Union was that it was monolithic. Okay? One of the big mistakes people make about the United States is that it's monolithic. Okay? You've got power vortexes in this country that are operating against each other. Okay? And I would say, look back to the Kennedy administration. I think that that's what you were seeing there. You were seeing one group of controllers working against another group of controllers and sending a message, that this is an Anglo-Saxon alliance here. You don't bring a Roman Catholic in to run this country and that stuff. Okay? Now that's the symbolic level. But there are there are banking interests. There's organized crime interests. There are drug trafficking interests. There are global economic issues that are involved here. Okay? And so that's why you see that there are emphasis. When the Republicans get in, they tend to really emphasize pushing on the whole oil issue. Okay? Because a lot of that comes from the oil belt. It comes from Louisiana, Tennessee, Texas, oil crowd. Okay? Jim Baker. Jim Baker's got a law firm in South Texas called Baker Botts. Okay? Baker Botts is the law firm for oil companies. We happened to do a story that had nothing to do with Afghanistan back in 1983. And Baker Botts was all over it, and it was all about oil. Okay? So, and that's where did the Taliban get brought? They got brought to Houston when they came here. Okay? They got brought in when they were trying to build the Unicol pipeline.
In cowboy hats.
1998, 99. That's an aspect of it. Okay? That is a big aspect of it. And the fact is that the Saudis are very much involved in financing all of this. And it's got to the point now where, the monopoly that the United States had on authority, on power, with the nuclear power and with the various fleets floating around the Pacific, and with the economy, the American economy. We're not the country we were in 1946, 47, 48, 49, 50. 1972, Richard Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard. It all began to shift. It became more of a poker game, okay? And so now we've got, you know, here we are 40 more years down the line, and the Saudis are very effective. They don't have to come to the United States for tractors or high technology. They can get it from the Chinese. They can get it from the Japanese. They can get it from the Russians. The Russians are the largest oil. I think they pump more oil, actually, than the Saudis. They don't think they distribute it. They're the second largest exporter, okay? They use it themselves, but that's what's keeping the Russian economy afloat right now, is oil. So you've got a complex world, and Americans, we're still locked in this whole, we have a whole thing about, you know, growing up in the Cold War and being imbued with this whole concept of the world we're living in. It's really very different. And we're very, very isolated here in this country. We don't get a lot of opinions that are outside the norm. That's why, you know, documentarians like Christina and the other people here who are trying to break outside the mold is so important to Americans. It's even got to the point where it's so incestuous. We got invited to speak at the Naval Postgraduate School this time last year out in Monterey to give them the ground truth of what was going on in Afghanistan. Because they're getting it from their own people. They're getting it from their own people who are basically using this narrative that was created for Charlie Wilson's war, which is a complete fabrication in many cases. And so as a result of that, they're getting into Afghanistan, they don't know what to do. They don't know what they're looking at.
Are you familiar with what you must be Russell Baker's book?
Yeah.
And I mean, I read that book and I just read it with, with a fascination. I mean, even as a child when Kennedy was shot that day, I remember as a child coming home and just saying, it's, you know, it's one group against the other. It's we don't see it, we don't know it. And all my life I wondered which group was it. And what he alleges in his book is quite remarkable because it all makes sense. It's like a puzzle that suddenly comes together. Yeah, I can see how the senior and how his father, Prescott, and how his interest in Germany at the time, and the Nazis, who were also basically provided with money from the wealthy individuals who controlled, you know, wars. And then down to George Bush, and then through all of these actions that have happened.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, duh, he's absolutely right. This is it.
That's why we actually felt that the idea we put in the voice was actually going into an ancient lineage, going back to you know, these knighthoods and the Fitzgerald family. That even gives a, this is what we're saying. All of these are real.
Going back to Henry VIII. It's going back to
before that. No, Henry II.
Henry II.
Yeah, no, this is actually,
there was a very interesting moment in history. Yeah. Right. And Richard DeClaire, the Earl of Pembroke, his father was involved with the, he was hunting in the New Forest the day that the king was shot with an arrow. Okay, this would have been 50 years earlier, and I didn't know that at the time. But in novelizing the story, I said, well, let's, you know, they say you write more than you know. Well, I wrote the declares into that particular episode in the forest in which the king gets shot with an arrow, and they're involved so that the new king can come on and they get in with the new king, okay? And that was exactly what had happened. So, you know, you once again, so, you know, this is something when you write novels, when you write screenplays, you start, Gore Vidal, when he wrote the novel Burr, he wrote in that novel that Aaron Burr had a hair trigger that was malfunctioning on his pistol. And that was the reason he lost the duel to Alexander Hamilton. I'm sorry, that Alexander Hamilton had it. And Burr actually lifted his gun and fired, and Alexander Hamilton's pistol misfired because he had a hair trigger he was trying to cheat.
Right.
Well, nobody knew that at the time. But Gore Vidal supposed that had to have been what happened. And of course, 10 years, 15 years later, they find the pistols that they had the duel with, and there's the hair trigger, and it doesn't work right. this fellow there.
I guess as far as the Western control of Eurasia, the desire to do that, is there anything at the core of it beyond, say, the control of Jerusalem and the Holy Land and things like the Himalayas and those sort of...
Brzezinski makes it pretty clear what the importance of Eurasia is all about. Eurasia is the future. It's the 21st, it's the 22nd century. China is now industrialized, Russia is industrialized, Russia has massive amounts of oil. If the Chinese and the Russians get together with the Indians on the subcontinent, put that all together, and you've got a global block of brain power and industrial power and resources that the United States simply can't compete with, and that Europe can't compete with either. So, you know, Europeans are a lot closer to the Russians than we are, and especially the Germans. And they're forging their own alliances, and they're going their own way. The question is that at some point, if the United States keeps pursuing this aggressive, we're, you know,
yes,
we're the grand power, we get to fly our predator drones over everybody. Sooner or later, and this has been supposed in certain military documents, that the containment process that the United States used towards China and the Soviet Union during the Cold War will be turned against the United States and Israel. And so we will be the ones quarantined, not so, and that's in the process of happening.
What are the things that, if we want to learn more about the situation in Afghanistan, what websites might we find good stuff on?
There's a bunch of things on Afghanistan. There's a good Global Post. Has got a woman, Jean McKenzie, who's done some very, very good reporting. We sat with her a few months ago, and I asked her, I said, what is your belief? She spent a lot of time there. And I said, what's your belief? What's going to happen? And so she said, it's going to be a civil war. And it's going to, and so I said, so do we stay or do we go? And she said, we should leave, because it's going to be a civil war anyway. If we stay, and we'll get caught up in the middle of it. So that's one website. Jean McKenzie does a lot of good reporting.
I think the Asia Times.
The Asia Times.
Certain people. It's not just the Asia Times.
Barbara Kumar is one of the people who does. Also, the Washington Post has done some very good reporting there. I have been told that the New York Times is continuing to be compromised when it comes to their coverage. That they do good coverage, but it's clearly from a very specific...
Look what happened just a week ago with this killing, the so-called the lone wolf killings.
Yes.
And the New York Post, the New York Times, and all the press in the United States says it was a lone wolf. And the people on the ground in Afghanistan are saying, look, this was premeditated, there were 20 soldiers in town. That's simply not covered.
No, it's not documented. No, I mean, we saw that by reading Barbara Kumar, who was on the Asia Times. And so, yeah, he's one, and I would just recommend, Ahmed Rashid has a new book out. But you've got to remember that, you know, you need a scorecard to tell the players. Ahmed Rashid is a Pakistani, and he all favors, if they favor talking with the Taliban and bringing them into the government, then you know that they're part of the traditional narrative. They're part of the agenda. The Taliban were created by Pakistan's ISI with the help of British intelligence and the CIA. Okay, so anybody who wants the Taliban, what the Obama administration is doing is they've gone right back to what the Clinton administration was doing in 1995 and 1996.
Which is basically, by the way, that going back to the British position. That's the whole point. And in 1947, the British handed over Pakistan and Afghanistan as a basically in terms of the region to the United States, and Pakistan was the ally to the United States. And that became the paradigm, and that's been continuing ever since then.
Yes.
Hi. I'd like to know, is extraterritoriality synonymous with mystical imperialism? And question number two, does Alex Crowley fit into any of this?
Crowley.
He winds his way up.
He's quite a character.
All of these people were being financed by some intelligence service. Okay, Blavatsky The British tried to arrest Blavatsky because they were convinced she was working for the Tsar. Okay? And Crowley offered himself to British intelligence.
They don't really know whether Crowley really worked for these people. The rumors are it could have gone either way, but he definitely was in in the esoteric world, and he was apparently one of the people who was using mystical powers, and that's what's so interesting is that. That is a foundation idea for the intelligence community. Right now, for instance, in the intelligence community, the use of something called remote viewing, the idea that you basically sit in a room and you project your consciousness to the past, the future, the present, wherever, and you help sneak into places through these kinds of means. These are practices that are quite common in the intelligence communities. Crowley would have been an earlier version of that. They used mystics and seers and and people who were able to do these things, but it's not really known whether Crowley actually did it or not.
Geopolitics is directly involved with extraterritoriality. Okay, that's the whole idea that if you have the resources you will need in order to conquer your neighbors. If your neighbor has the oil you need in order to survive, you'll conquer your neighbor. Okay, that's the basic idea behind geopolitics.
And that is without the divine intervention in it.
Well, the divine intervention becomes kind of like a justification.
Yeah, that's what George Bush said. God told him to invade Iraq. That's mystical imperialism, folks. That's it.
Mullah Omar is an avid dreamer. The Afghans are dreamers. Okay.
Publicly, they talk about.
They talk about the dreams. In fact, if Mullah Omar dreams that a certain place should be attacked, that God sent him that dream, and therefore he will. It's a divine message that God talks to you through your dreams.
Blame everything on God, right?
Yeah, well, that's what.
You have to be called manifest.
They take no personal responsibility, and that is the problem.
Right.
That is the problem with it.
Yes.
Exactly. They get to blame God. God told me to do it, or I failed God if it didn't work.
This is determinism. It's determinism.
But it's adolescent behavior too.
Pardon?
It's adolescent behavior.
Well, it is, but when we're dealing with it at this macro level, I don't think words like adolescent are going to go very far. We're talking about such a huge system that's gone on so long. This is dysfunctional. This is far more than adolescent.
Well, we
this
first
is
started
completely
out
dysfunctional.
doing our documentary on the arms race in the economy. And I had got myself a job, a TV show on Pat Robertson's local TV station up in Boston. I was not a born-again Christian. We had this thing called the equal time provision, where he had to be airing all these things, which is why that basically balanced the conservative right-wing programming that he was airing. So I went to the management, and they were airing this thing called the SALT Syndrome, which was an anti-SALT II documentary. That the Soviet Union was ready to burst out of their seams. The tanks were going to be rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue any minute, and it was a screed to this kind of idea.
Brzezinski must have told him that, right?
Well, it was all the same old people. I mean, it was American Security Council, which was apparently on the board of directors of all oil company executives who would put this thing out. And it was the traditional group of people, Paul Nitzer and all these other people who were involved in every single run-up of the defense budget historically. So anyway, I went to the management and I said, you can't air this thing 5 times a day as a public service message without airing something in opposition to it. So they said, fine, what do you want to do? I said, well, a friend just invited me down to interview some people about the SALT II treaty. And why don't you let me, do that, and we'll put it together, we'll package it as a documentary, and you can run it on CBN if you want to, okay, to meet your equal time provision. So they thought it over, and they said, fine, you can have $100 or something to that effect. It wasn't a lot of money. Anyway, so we said, okay, we'll see what we can do. So we had already bought some equipment of our own, so we started to put these things together, and we found, when we went, the Boston area at this particular time had all these people who worked on the Manhattan Project. They were all in academia. They were all mostly at MIT, or they were at Tufts, or they were at BU. Philip and Phyllis Morrison. Somebody said, oh, you got to talk to Philip and Phyllis Morrison. Okay, they've worked on the Manhattan Project. So we got on the phone and said, can we talk to you? They said, we'll be right over. So they came over for lunch. I mean, it was that kind of thing. They just wanted to talk about the moral background of this thing and how this whole crazy thing got started in the first place, the Manhattan Project, and how they felt that they had control and they wanted to put moral controls over it as it developed. And then when Germany was defeated, they had really mostly done it to use against Germany because they were afraid Germany was going to develop one. So when they turned around and they used it, we're going to use it against the Japanese, they were outraged, most of these people.